Just to introduce myself again, I'm Rebecca Green. I am the co-director of the election law program at William & Mary Law School. And we're so pleased to have you with us to talk about this very important issue. And I think this panel will serve to sort of cap off the morning and talk sort of real politic about ways forward for voting rights for DC residents. Let me introduce our panelists, and then afterward, after they've made a few remarks, this will be just sort of a free-flow discussion, and I welcome participation from the audience for those of you who want to chime in. So I'll start with Chairman Davis, who served as U.S. Congressman from Virginia's 11th District from 1994 to 2008. He served as the chairman of the House Government Reform Committee and is currently the Director of Federal Government Affairs at Deloitte and Touche. Congressman Davis has been a pivotal actor in the movement for DC voting rights, and few have a better understanding of the politics of this, so he's the perfect person to sit on this panel. Then comes Bob Bauer. Bob Bauer is an attorney, a partner at Perkins Coie. He is an author and a blogger. He served as White House counsel from 2009 to 2011. And in 2013, President Obama nominated Mr. Bauer to co-chair the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which he co-chaired with Ben Ginsburg. So you had sort of one extremely prominent Democratic election lawyer and one extremely prominent Republican election attorney. And the commission was able to issue a report that did a huge amount of good in terms of bridging the differences between Democrats and Republicans. And to their credit, a lot of that has to do with Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsburg and their approach. And so I'm hoping that he will share some of his sort of success stories in that experience and perhaps apply them to the situation here. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Chairman Davis to sort of walk us through what the current politics are on this issue. He's been working on this for a while now, but maybe a picture of where things stand in his mind.
Well, first of all, how did I get involved in this? I ended up being chairman of in my first year in Congress of the District of Columbia subcommittee. It's rare for a freshman to be chairman of a subcommittee, but before I beat my chest too hard, the District of Columbia subcommittee is the least sought after subcommittee assignment in the Congress. But the city had a huge financial crisis at that point, so I authored what became known as the Control Board Act and a number of other legislation affecting the city, the Revitalization Act, doing away with their unfunded pension liability, the College Access Act. And finally, we went to the crux of this, and that is in the capital of the free world, they don't get a vote in the Congress. Was this intended by the framers? Why is this? Ultimately, I mean, my short answer is it's ultimately very political. This is a very democratic city, and Republicans are loath to just hand over another vote. These seats are fought after with millions of dollars. I dare say if this were a very Republican city, the roles would be reversed. And that's basically when I got to my caucus and brought it up, they said, Davis, you were chairman of the House Campaign Committee 2 cycles. Why you want to give them a vote? Well, my legislation would have added 2 seats to the House. The next seat under the census, the way it worked, would have been Utah, which would have been a Republican seat. First, the Democrats didn't want to go along because they thought it was a plot to do away with Matheson, who was the one Democrat in the Utah House delegation. But we were finally able to convince them that this was a sincere effort. Actually passed it through the House without any amendments in 2007, where it was met with a filibuster in the Senate. We did extensive hearings on this to make sure that the vote in the House could pass constitutional muster. We had Viet Dinh, who was a Bush administration lead attorney in the Justice Department, and Ken Starr, whose conservative credentials I think are well known, testify in favor of this, basically talking about the supremacy of the district clause. That under that, the Congress had the ability to do what they wanted. And the distinction between in the Senate, senators represent states, the House represents people. And the fact that for the first few years of our republic, I think the first 12 years of our republic, people who lived in the District of Columbia actually voted for Congress. I think there's some evidence one of the members was from there. They voted on the Virginia side with Virginia and on the Maryland side with Maryland. But in 1800, you had a contested election that went to the House of Representatives. It went on so late they never got around to deciding what would happen to the vote in Congress, and it just kind of disappeared. Let me give a little historical context. In previous, when the district clause was put into the Constitution, no one knew where the city would be. New Yorkers thought it could stay it could be in New York, where it was for the first 12 years. Philadelphia thought this would be a perfect spot for it. This is where the Continental Congress had met. And of course, the Southerners wanted it on the banks of the Potomac, but nobody knew where it was going to be. We just knew it was going to be 100 square miles. In one Congress, in fact, it passed the House that it was going to be in Philadelphia, but time ran out. They ran the clock out on it, and it never became law. And in the next Congress, a deal was struck, whereas it would stay in New York for a period of time. The United States would pick up revolutionary debt, which was very important to the states in the North, and the South would get the capital. At that point, they weren't sure what other issues would arise, so they put this district clause, which gave Congress basically the power to adjudicate what would happen in the District of Columbia, and it's been widely used and never overturned by a court. But imagine this: if the capital had been set in Philadelphia? Do you think Philadelphia would have been without a vote? I think the answer is no. This was a sparsely populated area at the time, though. And in 1800, because of the contested election between Adams and Jefferson that went to the House of Representatives, they just never got around to focusing on this issue. So it is my belief, because representatives represent people, the historical context for this, that should Congress decide to allow the city a vote, you could do this through simple statute and not necessarily through a constitutional amendment, which would be full of partisan ramifications. My Utah effort, by the way, there were 23 Republicans. I did pick up on that. Darrell Issa, who's the current chairman of the committee, voted for it. Paul Ryan, who was our vice presidential, voted for it. Mike Pence, now governor of Indiana, voted for it. We had a number of members to do it, but we were 3 votes short in the Senate, including 2 Democrats at the time, Robert Byrd and Max Baucus. We were close to trying to reverse that, but this was just never a priority for Harry Reid. And in the next Congress after I left, they were able to pass D.C. voter rights through the Senate. But the House couldn't get it together because of some gun amendments that were added on there, and they just didn't want to have to. They wanted the whole deal, and we can have a long discussion about the trade-offs and what that entailed. There is some constitutional scholars who think you cannot do this by statute. Of course, ultimately the court would probably, the way things are going, it would be 5-4 one way or the other. But it would go up there. But I think there's a very strong case, and I think our hearings laid that predicate. There's a very strong case that this could be done, at least voting representative in the House by statute.
So in terms of looking at where we are today, can you reflect on what you think is sort of the most likely path forward, given the political climate, that we're in today?
Well, I said at the time with the gun thing on, I just said, look, for Democrats, you're not going to get a better alignment than you have now. You got your 60 votes, which is what you currently need, unless they go back and change the rules again. You have your votes to put this thing through. You're not going to get this after this. And of course, in 2010, erased that margin very, very quickly. And I don't think it's likely over the next 2-3 Congresses that Democrats are likely to rise to that majority. In fact, their majority is even jeopardized for this next midterm election. So this comes down to the Senate. I think Leader McConnell thinks that if you allow it in the House, somebody's going to try to slip something on the Senate. And I don't think he particularly cares about the House. But the Senate, they do care about. Mm-hmm. And so they stepped on that right away. Just as an aside, I did go over and talk to one of the members after he got in trouble with the leadership and had a spat of bad publicity, and explained to him the situation. He said, well, I never even thought about it, frankly. Just the leader said vote against this thing, and that's what we did. And he said, you explained it, makes a lot of sense. We thought we could get Hagel to join him and bring some people back. We thought we actually had the votes, but Reid didn't want to waste the floor time on it. Mm-hmm. So this is not, this has not been a priority, in my opinion, for leaders. It's gone back and forth. There have been other priorities. I'm convinced that the administration made this a priority, but their first term when they had those supermajorities, this probably could have gotten done. But it was the gun amendments that was put on in the Senate and that the House was afraid of that I think that killed it, and the inability of the advocates to accept that kind of condition.
Right. Mr. Bauer, did you want to jump off there?
Yes, my observations are really based, or the question I suppose I would address here, and that I've been thinking about is, what are the potential conditions for a dialogue that transcends partisan division. The chairman says quite rightly that no political party is terribly eager to yield what it views as an automatic seat in the Congress to the opposing party. And it's an awful lot easier for voters elsewhere in the United States simply not to care one way or the other about the denial of the franchise to the citizens of the District of Columbia. I've been thinking a lot about dialogue that transcends partisan division because the Presidential Commission, of which I was a member, was charged with having such a dialogue. Of course, the nature of what we addressed was quite different because, and I'll say this just at the outset, we were able to address a set of obstacles to the vote that are experienced across the country. And so Democrats and Republicans eventually could agree, I think, because Democrats and Republicans as voters experience these obstacles. And so there was the basis for a discussion that transcended party lines. Now, having said all of that, I would, and I'd be interested if the chairman agreed with this, if others agreed with this, I'd like to think, and this may be simply a result of the exhaustion that follows the production of a report that you're relieved to have been able to put out at all. And so my thinking on this might be quite foggy, but I would like to believe that in almost paradoxical fashion, because of all the attention that's being focused in this country on voting rights, obviously some of it is being expressed in very partisan terms, the divisions over voter identification requirements, the divisions over the Voting Rights Act, and whether or not the amendments proposed are good amendments or not good amendments. Nonetheless, voting rights is actually a significant topic of conversation on the policy and constitutional level in this country. People are talking about it. And I understand in earlier panels, there was a view that these kinds of conversations don't move forward unless they're attached to something else, like the question of whether or not you can deny the right to vote to young people who are being drafted into war, for example. That voting rights then surfaces in a completely different context where it gains its urgency from that context. But I wonder whether we're at a point now, I don't know that we are, where there's enough attention being focused to what we stand for as a country in thinking about and doing something about voting rights, access to the franchise and the elimination of unnecessary obstacles to the exercise of the franchise, that doesn't enable the DC conversation to be brought into that in a way that otherwise was not the case before. Now, I'm not being wildly optimistic about it, again, because the question of whether DC residents are allowed to vote is a question that affects fundamentally DC residents and the people who care, like Chairman Davis has, about that issue. And that's not a large universe of people. But nonetheless, you know, there is a framework for a conversation, and that brings me to my last comment, because I have been thinking a great deal about it. It does mean that everybody needs to go back and look at the way the dialogue has been conducted in the past and see whether or not it can be cleansed of what I call conversation-stopping slogans or departure points. Whether in campaign finance or gerrymandering or voting rights generally, what you oftentimes find is the conversation is impossible because each side has decided on certain, if you will, top-line propositions that the other side, upon hearing, refuses to engage with. And so that's the end of the discussion right there. Everybody comes in, if you will, fully armed for battle and is displaying their favorite sharp and shiny point of the spear. And that's the end of it. And I found when we were going around the country in this presidential commission that if you could step back from that, if you could literally wipe the slate completely clean and find a different grounding for the conversation,